The blood on her hands was not her own, and that was the only reason Sarah Whitmore still had the strength to run through the Wyoming mountains in the dead of winter, her breath coming in ragged gasps that turned to ice crystals in the frigid air of 1878. She had left everything behind in Cheyenne, the boarding house where she had worked for 3 years, the small room that smelled of lavender and old wood, the carefully saved coins hidden beneath a loose floorboard, and most importantly, the body of Gerald Whitmore, her husband of 8 months, lying in a pool of his own blood on the floor of the saloon where he had gone to drink away his anger. Sarah had not killed him, but she had watched him die at the hands of the gambler he had accused of cheating. And when the sheriff arrived, when she saw the way he looked at her with suspicion in his eyes, she knew that staying meant hanging. The territorial courts were not kind to women who stood to inherit property, even if that property was only a worn saddle and a mare too old to pull a plow. The mountain trail was narrow and treacherous, covered in snow that had fallen for 3 days straight, and Sarah's boots, meant for walking on wooden floors and packed earth streets, offered little protection against the cold that seeped through the worn leather and into her bones. She had been running for hours, though she could not say exactly how many, and the sun was beginning its descent behind the peaks, casting long shadows that turned the white landscape into something otherworldly and strange. Her fingers were numb inside the thin gloves she wore, and her shawl, soaked through from the snow, hung heavy on her shoulders like a burden she could not shake. It was the smell of smoke that made her change direction, the faint scent of burning pine wood that meant shelter and warmth and possibly salvation. She followed it with the desperation of a woman who knew that another night in the open would be her last, stumbling through drifts that came up to her knees, her skirts tangling around her legs and making every step an exercise in determination. The smoke grew stronger as she climbed, and then she saw it. A small cabin nestled against the side of the mountain, its chimney sending up a steady stream of gray smoke that stood out against the darkening sky. Sarah approached carefully, aware that whoever lived in such isolation might not welcome strangers, but the cold had reached a point where caution seemed less important than survival. She knocked on the door with hands that could barely form a fist, and when there was no immediate answer, she knocked again, harder this time, desperation making her bold. The door opened so suddenly that she stumbled forward, and would have fallen if not for the man who stood in the doorway, his hand shooting out to catch her elbow with reflexes that spoke of years spent in dangerous places. He was tall, taller than any man Sarah had ever seen, with shoulders broad enough to fill the doorframe and arms thick with muscle that showed even through the heavy wool shirt he wore. His hair was dark brown, almost black in the fading light, and hung past his shoulders in waves that looked like they had been trimmed with a hunting knife rather than scissors. His face was weathered and tanned, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of beard, and eyes that were the color of storm clouds, gray and penetrating and cautious. "Please," Sarah managed to say, her voice barely more than a whisper through lips that were blue with cold. "I need help." The man studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her sodden clothes, her trembling form, the desperation in her eyes. Then he stepped aside, pulling the door open wider. "Get inside before you freeze to death." The warmth of the cabin hit Sarah like a physical thing, and she stumbled toward the fireplace without waiting for an invitation, sinking to her knees on the rough wooden floor and holding her hands out to the flames. The man closed the door and moved past her with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own space, and she heard him doing something behind her, but the fire held all her attention, the blessed heat of it making her fingers ache as feeling began to return. "Here." The man's voice was deep and rough, like gravel shifting in a riverbed. He draped a blanket over her shoulders, this one dry and smelling faintly of pine and leather. "You need to get out of those wet clothes or the warmth will not do you any good. There is a partition over there, and I have some things that might fit you well enough." Sarah turned to look at him, really look at him for the first time. He had to be in his early 30s, she guessed, with the kind of build that came from years of hard physical labor. His hands were large and scarred, the hands of a man who worked with them, and there was a knife on his belt that looked well used. But his eyes, despite their caution, held no cruelty, and when he handed her a bundle of clothes, his movements were careful, unthreatening. "Thank you," she said, and her voice cracked on the words. He nodded once and turned away, busying himself at the stove in the corner of the cabin while Sarah made her way behind the wooden partition he had indicated. The space was small but private, and she peeled off her wet clothes with fingers that were clumsy with cold, letting them fall in a sodden heap on the floor. The clothes he had given her were clearly his own, a wool shirt that hung to her knees and a pair of trousers that she had to roll up several times, but they were dry and warm, and she pulled them on with a gratitude that made her throat tight. When she emerged, the man was ladling something from a pot into a tin bowl. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable, then held out the bowl. Stew. It is not much, but it will warm you from the inside. Sarah took the bowl with both hands, cradling it like something precious, and the smell of meat and vegetables made her realize that she had not eaten since the morning before Gerald died. She sat on the bench near the fire and ate slowly, aware of the man watching her from across the room, his own bowl in his hands. "I am Elijah," he said after a long silence. "Elijah Thornton. This is my cabin, and you are welcome to stay until the storm passes or until you are well enough to travel, whichever comes first." "Sarah," she replied, and then hesitated, wondering if she should give her real name, wondering if news of Gerald's death had already spread beyond Cheyenne. But lying seemed wrong, especially to a man who had just saved her life. Sarah Whitmore. Elijah nodded, as if the name meant nothing to him, and perhaps it did not. A man who lived this far from civilization probably had little interest in the affairs of towns and their people. "What brought you up into the mountains in the middle of winter, Sarah Whitmore?" The question was asked in a tone that suggested he already knew she was running from something, and Sarah saw no point in trying to hide it. "I am running from the law. They think I killed my husband, but I did not. I watched him die, but I did not kill him." Elijah was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes studying her face as if trying to read the truth in it. Did he deserve to die? The question surprised her, and Sarah found herself answering honestly. Yes, he was cruel and violent, and he gambled away every penny we had. But I would not have killed him. I am not a murderer. "Then you have nothing to fear from me," Elijah said simply. "The law does not reach this far up the mountain, and even if it did, I have little use for lawmen who cannot tell the difference between a murderer and a widow." Relief flooded through Sarah, so intense that she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them away and focused on her stew, eating until the bowl was empty and the warmth had spread from her stomach to her limbs. Elijah took the bowl from her when she was done and refilled it without comment, and she ate that one too, slower this time, savoring the simple comfort of hot food and a warm fire. The storm outside intensified as night fell, the wind howling around the cabin like a living thing, and Sarah was deeply grateful to be inside, safe and warm. Elijah moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, banking the fire and checking the shutters on the windows, and she watched him with a curiosity she could not quite suppress. He was unlike any man she had ever known, self-sufficient and capable in a way that spoke of years spent alone in the wilderness. "You live here by yourself?" she asked, and he nodded. 5 years now. I came up here after the war, after I had seen enough of what men do to each other. Up here, there is only the mountain and the animals, and they are honest in their intentions." Sarah understood that kind of weariness, the desire to escape from a world that had proven itself cruel and unpredictable. "Do you ever get lonely?" Elijah considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes. But loneliness is better than the alternative, or at least it has been until now." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt something shift, a recognition of kinship that surprised her. She barely knew this man, and yet she felt safer here, in his remote cabin, than she had felt in months of marriage to Gerald. "You can have the bed," Elijah said, gesturing to the narrow cot in the corner of the cabin. "I will sleep on the floor by the fire." Sarah wanted to protest, to insist that he keep his own bed, but exhaustion was settling over her like a heavy blanket, and the thought of lying down was too tempting to resist. She made her way to the cot and lay down fully clothed, pulling the wool blanket up to her chin. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Elijah settling onto the floor with his own blanket, his back against the wall and his eyes on the door, a silent guardian keeping watch through the night. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and the pale light of dawn filtering through the cracks in the shutters. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, and then it all came rushing back: Gerald's death, her flight into the mountains, the cabin, and the man who had taken her in. She sat up slowly, her body stiff and sore from the ordeal of the previous day, and saw Elijah at the stove, his back to her as he worked. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. He turned, and she saw that he had shaved, his jaw now clean and revealing the strong lines of his face. "Morning. The storm has passed, but there is at least 3 feet of new snow outside. You will not be going anywhere for a few days." Sarah nodded, surprised to find that she was not disappointed by this news. The thought of leaving the warmth and safety of the cabin to face the cold and the uncertainty of what waited for her in Cheyenne was not appealing. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not," Elijah said, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups and handing her one. "I have supplies enough for 2, and the company is not unwelcome." They fell into a routine over the next few days, a pattern that felt surprisingly natural, despite the strangeness of their situation. Elijah went out each morning to check his traps and hunt, and Sarah stayed in the cabin, tending the fire and preparing meals from the stores of dried meat and beans and flour that lined the shelves. She found a strange comfort in the simple tasks, in the repetition of chopping vegetables and stirring pots, in the quiet satisfaction of keeping a home even if it was not her own. Elijah was not much of a talker, but Sarah found that she did not mind the silence. There was something restful about it, a lack of expectation that allowed her to simply exist without having to perform or pretend. When they did talk, their conversations were brief but honest, touching on their pasts and their hopes for the future, in a way that felt intimate despite the careful distance they maintained. I was a soldier," Elijah told her one evening as they sat by the fire, the light playing across his features and highlighting the scars that marked his hands and arms. "Fought in the war, saw things that no man should see. When it was over, I could not go back to the life I had before. Everything felt hollow and meaningless, so I came up here, where the only thing that matters is survival." "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked, watching his face carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but mostly I'm grateful. Up here I do not have to pretend to be something I'm not. I can just be Elijah, the mountain man, and that is enough." Sarah understood that feeling more than she could say. She had spent so much of her life trying to be what others expected, the dutiful daughter, the obedient wife, and it had brought her nothing but misery. Here, in this cabin at the edge of the world, she could simply be Sarah, and that was a freedom she had not known she craved. As the days passed, Sarah found herself watching Elijah more closely, noticing the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt as he worked, the careful gentleness with which he handled everything despite his size and strength. He was a man of contradictions, hard and capable on the outside, but with a tenderness that showed in small ways, in the way he made sure she had the warmest blanket, in the way he saved the best portions of meat for her, in the way he listened when she spoke, as if her words mattered. One morning, Sarah woke to find fresh blood on her undergarments and realized with a start that her monthly courses had come. She had been so focused on survival that she had not even thought about it, but now it presented a problem. She had nothing with her, no rags or supplies, and the thought of asking Elijah for help made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. But there was no one else to ask, and so she forced herself to approach him as he sat by the fire, sharpening his knife. "Elijah, I need to ask you something, and it is somewhat delicate." He looked up at her, his gray eyes attentive. "Go ahead." Sarah took a deep breath. "I need some cloth, old shirts or rags, anything that can be used for personal purposes. My monthly courses have come, and I have nothing." To her surprise, Elijah did not seem embarrassed or uncomfortable. He simply nodded and stood, moving to a chest in the corner of the cabin. He pulled out several old shirts, worn and soft with age, and handed them to her. "Will these work?" "Yes, thank you," Sarah said, touched by his matter-of-fact response. Many men would have been horrified or awkward, but Elijah treated it as simply another practical matter to be addressed. "If you need anything else, just ask," he said, returning to his work as if the conversation had never happened. It was a small thing, but it made Sarah see Elijah in a new light. He was not like the men she had known in town, who thought women's needs were something shameful or disgusting. He was practical and respectful, and she found herself liking him more with each passing day. The weeks blended together in a way that made Sarah lose track of time. The snow continued to fall intermittently, sometimes light dustings that barely covered the ground, other times heavy storms that kept them trapped inside for days at a time. Sarah's life in Cheyenne began to feel like something that had happened to someone else, a distant memory that held no power over her present. She and Elijah grew more comfortable with each other, their conversations lasting longer, delving deeper into topics that mattered. Sarah told him about her childhood in Missouri, about her parents who had died of fever when she was 16, about the desperation that had led her to accept Gerald's proposal, even though she had known in her heart that he was not a good man. "I thought that any husband was better than no husband," she said one night, her voice quiet in the darkness. "I thought that marriage would give me security, a home, a place in the world. But all it gave me was fear and bruises and the constant worry that one day he would go too far." Elijah was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was tight with controlled anger. "No woman should have to live that way. A man who raises his hand to his wife is not a man at all." "You sound like you have strong feelings about it," Sarah observed. "I do," Elijah said. "My father was a brutal man, and my mother bore the brunt of it until the day she died. I swore then that I would never be like him, that I would never hurt someone weaker than me just because I could." Sarah felt something warm bloom in her chest, a respect and admiration for this man who had turned his back on violence despite coming from it. "You are nothing like that. You are kind and gentle, and I am grateful that I found your cabin that night." "I am grateful too," Elijah said, and the words carried a weight that made Sarah's breath catch. The attraction between them had been growing steadily, a slow burn that neither of them had acknowledged but both of them felt. Sarah found herself noticing everything about Elijah, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he leaned over his work, the deep rumble of his laugh when something amused him, the strength in his hands, and the gentleness with which he used them. She caught him watching her sometimes, his gray eyes intense and filled with something that made her heart race. But neither of them acted on it, held back by caution and respect and the uncertainty of their situation. Sarah was still technically a married woman, even if her husband was dead, and the propriety that had been drilled into her since childhood made her hesitant to cross that line. Elijah, for his part, seemed determined to be a perfect gentleman, never touching her unnecessarily, always maintaining a careful distance. It was nearly March when everything changed. Sarah had been with Elijah for almost 2 months, and the snow was finally beginning to melt, revealing the brown earth and the first hints of green that promised spring. She was outside, enjoying the weak sunshine and the fresh air, when she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She sat down heavily on the bench outside the cabin door, pressing her hand to her forehead and trying to understand what was wrong. That was when it hit her. She had not had her monthly courses since that first time, more than a month ago. At first, she had thought it was the stress, the change in environment, the physical toll of her flight through the mountains. But now, sitting in the spring sunshine with her hand pressed to her stomach, she knew the truth. She was pregnant with Gerald's child. The realization was like a physical blow, and Sarah felt tears stream down her face before she could stop them. She had escaped her husband, escaped the life he had forced on her, only to discover that she would carry a piece of him with her forever. The child was innocent, she knew that, but the thought of bearing Gerald's baby filled her with a complicated mix of emotions she could not begin to untangle. Elijah found her there, crying on the bench, and his face filled with concern. "Sarah, what is wrong? Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak, and he knelt in front of her, his large hands gentle on her shoulders. "Talk to me. Whatever it is, we can face it together." The kindness in his voice broke something open inside her, and the words tumbled out. "I am pregnant. I'm carrying Gerald's child, and I do not know what to do." Elijah was very still for a moment, and Sarah could not read his expression. Then he moved to sit beside her on the bench, his solid presence a comfort. "How do you feel about it?" "I do not know," Sarah admitted. "I'm afraid, I'm angry, I'm sad. I do not know how I can raise a child alone, and I do not know if I even want to carry this reminder of him." "You are not alone," Elijah said firmly. "You have me, if you want me. I know we have not known each other long, and I know this is complicated. But Sarah, I have come to care for you deeply. The thought of you facing this by yourself is unbearable." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing the sincerity in his gray eyes, the determination in the set of his jaw. "You would do that? You would help me raise another man's child?" "Yes," Elijah said without hesitation. "The child did not choose its parents, and it deserves a chance at a good life. And you, Sarah Whitmore, you deserve to be happy and safe and loved. If you will have me, I will stand by you through all of it." The tears came harder now, but they were tears of relief and gratitude and something else, something that felt like the beginning of love. Sarah leaned into Elijah's solid warmth, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her as she cried, his hands rubbing soothing circles on her back. "I care for you too," Sarah said when she could finally speak again. "I have been afraid to admit it, afraid that it was too soon or too complicated, but, Elijah, I think I am falling in love with you." She felt his arms tighten around her, and when he pulled back to look at her face, his eyes were bright with emotion. "Then let me court you properly. Let me show you what it means to be cherished and respected. And when you are ready, when the time is right, let me marry you and make this official." Sarah nodded, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Yes, yes to all of it." Elijah cupped her face in his large hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears, and then he leaned in and kissed her. It was gentle and sweet, a promise rather than a demand, and Sarah felt something inside her that had been broken begin to heal. Their relationship changed after that conversation, becoming something deeper and more intentional. Elijah courted Sarah the way she had always dreamed of being courted, with small gestures of affection and respect that made her feel valued. He picked wildflowers for her when they began to bloom and left them on the table for her to find. He taught her how to shoot his rifle, standing behind her with his arms around her, guiding her aim and praising her when she hit the target. He talked to her about his dreams for the future, about building a bigger cabin, about raising horses and cattle, about creating a life that was full and meaningful. Sarah bloomed under his attention like a flower in spring. The fear and tension that had marked her marriage to Gerald melted away, replaced by a contentment and joy she had never known. Her belly began to swell with the baby, and though she still had complicated feelings about the pregnancy, Elijah's unwavering support made it easier to bear. I have been thinking," Elijah said one evening as they sat together on the bench outside the cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. "We should get married before the baby comes. I want the child to have my name, and I want you to be my wife in truth as well as in my heart." "I would like that," Sarah said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "But how? We are miles from any town or church." "There is a missionary who travels through these mountains," Elijah explained, "Father Joseph. He comes by once or twice a year, performing marriages and baptisms for the people who live up here. I can ride down to the settlement and leave word for him to stop here on his next circuit." Sarah nodded, excited by the prospect. "How long do you think it will take?" "A few weeks, maybe a month. But Sarah, even if we cannot make it official right away, know that in my heart you are already my wife. Nothing will change that." "And you are my husband," Sarah replied, turning to kiss him. "In every way that matters." The weeks passed in a haze of happiness. Sarah's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and though she experienced the usual discomforts, Elijah was endlessly patient and attentive. He rubbed her swollen feet in the evenings and held her hair back when morning sickness struck. He built her a rocking chair, carefully crafted from wood he had seasoned for years, and presented it to her with shy pride. Father Joseph arrived in early May, a cheerful man in his 50s with a white beard and kind eyes. He listened to their story without judgment, blessed their union, and married them in a simple ceremony outside the cabin, with the mountains as witnesses and the sky above them clear and blue. "By the power vested in me by the Catholic Church and the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Father Joseph said, his voice carrying across the meadow. "You may kiss your bride, Elijah." Elijah did, thoroughly, and with a joy that made Sarah laugh against his mouth. When they pulled apart, she saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears, and she reached up to cup his face, her own eyes swimming. "I love you," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. I love you too, Sarah Thornton, Elijah replied, and the name sounded right, like it had always been hers. Father Joseph stayed for dinner and left the next morning with their thanks and a pouch of coins that Elijah insisted he take. For the church, Elijah said, and the priest accepted with grace. Summer arrived in full force, bringing with it warm days and cool nights and an abundance of life. Sarah's belly grew round and heavy, and she moved through the cabin with increasing slowness, one hand always pressed to her lower back. Elijah doted on her, refusing to let her do anything strenuous, taking over all the tasks that required bending or lifting. I am pregnant, not helpless, Sarah protested one afternoon as Elijah gently but firmly moved her aside so he could knead the bread dough. I know, he said with a grin, but humor me. I like taking care of you. Sarah could not argue with that, so she settled into her rocking chair and watched him work, admiring the play of muscles in his forearms and the concentration on his face. Life with Elijah was everything she had never known she wanted, simple and peaceful and full of love. But as summer turned to fall, Sarah began to worry about the birth. She had attended a few births in Cheyenne, helping the midwife when extra hands were needed, and she knew that childbirth was dangerous, that women died in labor more often than anyone liked to acknowledge. The nearest town was a full day's ride away, too far to fetch help if something went wrong, and the thought of giving birth alone, with only Elijah to help, terrified her. Elijah sensed her fear and addressed it head on. I have delivered foals and calves, he said one night as they lay in their bed, his hand resting on her swollen belly. I know it is not the same, but the basics are the same. I will not let anything happen to you, Sarah. I swear it on my life. I trust you, Sarah said, and she did. If anyone could keep her safe, it was Elijah with his steady hands and his unshakable calm. The baby was due in late October, according to Sarah's calculations, but October came and went with no signs of labor. November arrived, cold and crisp, and still the baby showed no interest in making an appearance. Sarah grew increasingly uncomfortable, her belly so large that she could barely sleep, and her patience wore thin. This child is stubborn, she complained one morning, pressing her hand to her side where the baby was kicking vigorously, just like its father. Which father? Elijah asked with a raised eyebrow, and Sarah laughed despite her discomfort. Both of them, apparently. The first contraction came on a cold November morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise. Sarah was in the kitchen, trying to make breakfast, when she felt a tightening in her belly that took her breath away. She gripped the edge of the table and breathed through it, and when it passed, she called for Elijah. He came immediately, his face concerned. Is it time? I think so, Sarah said, and another contraction hit, stronger this time. Yes, it is definitely time. Elijah moved into action with a calm efficiency that soothed Sarah's fears. He helped her to the bed, which he had already prepared with clean sheets and towels, and then he checked the supplies he had gathered, water and cloths and a sharp knife that he had sterilized in boiling water. The labor was long and difficult. The contractions came in waves, each one stronger than the last, and Sarah lost track of time, lost track of everything except the pain and the relentless pressure. Elijah stayed by her side through all of it, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring words of encouragement that kept her anchored. You are doing so well, Sarah, he said, his voice steady even though she could see the worry in his eyes. You are the strongest woman I have ever known. I cannot do this, Sarah gasped as another contraction tore through her. It hurts too much. You can, Elijah insisted, gripping her hand tighter. You can do this, Sarah. I am right here with you, and I am not going anywhere. The hours blended together, day turning to night and then to day again. Sarah was exhausted, her body trembling with fatigue, but Elijah was tireless, his presence a constant source of strength. He held her hand through the long wait, never leaving her side, never complaining, his gray eyes never leaving her face. Finally, as dawn broke on the second day, the baby crowned. I can see the head, Elijah said, his voice tight with emotion. Just a few more pushes, Sarah. You are almost there. Sarah gathered the last of her strength and pushed, feeling the baby slide free in a rush of fluid and relief. She heard a thin wail, and then Elijah was placing a warm, slippery bundle on her chest, his hands shaking. It is a boy, he said, his voice breaking. Sarah, we have a son. Sarah looked down at the tiny face, the eyes screwed shut and the mouth open in a cry, and felt a rush of love so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. The baby was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and long fingers that gripped her thumb when she offered it. Elijah cut the cord and wrapped the baby in a clean blanket, his movements gentle and sure. And then he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the child in Sarah's arms with an expression of wonder. Sarah saw the tears streaming down his face, saw the way his broad shoulders shook, and realized that he was weeping, hard, unashamed sobs that spoke of overwhelming emotion. "Elijah," she said softly, reaching out to touch his face. He leaned into her touch, his eyes red and wet. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick. I never imagined I would have this, a wife, a child, a family. It is more than I ever dared to hope for." Sarah pulled him closer, and he wrapped his arms around both her and the baby, his large body curving protectively around them. "You have it now," she said, her own tears falling. "We have it. We are a family." They stayed like that for a long time, the three of them together in the quiet cabin as the sun rose higher in the sky. Eventually, Elijah stirred, pressing a kiss to Sarah's forehead, and then to the baby's. "We need to get you cleaned up and comfortable, and the little one needs to eat." Sarah nodded, and Elijah helped her through the afterbirth and cleaned her with a gentleness that made her love him even more. Then he brought her fresh clothes and helped her into them, his touch careful and respectful. The baby latched onto Nurse with surprising vigor, and Sarah marveled at the tiny mouth, the way the baby's eyes opened briefly to reveal dark blue irises. "What should we name him?" Elijah asked, sitting beside her on the bed and watching the baby with fascination. Sarah considered. She did not want to name the child after Gerald, did not want to tie him to a man who had been cruel and violent, but she also did not want to name him after anyone from her past, wanted instead to give him a name that spoke of hope and new beginnings. "What about James?" she suggested. "It is a strong name, and it does not carry any painful memories." "James Thornton," Elijah said, trying it out. "I like it. It suits him." They spent the next few days in a cocoon of new parenthood, learning the rhythms of their son's needs, marveling at every tiny sound and movement. James was a good baby, sleeping for long stretches and nursing well, and Sarah recovered quickly from the birth, her body resilient and strong. Elijah was a devoted father, changing James's nappies without complaint, walking him around the cabin when he fussed, singing to him in a deep, rumbling voice that seemed to soothe the baby instantly. Sarah watched him with wonder, seeing the way his hard edges softened when he held their son, the way his face lit up with joy at every little milestone. "I was so afraid," Sarah admitted one night as they lay in bed with James asleep between them in a small cradle that Elijah had built. "Afraid that I would not love him because of who his father was. But Elijah, I love him so much it hurts." "Of course you do," Elijah said, reaching across the cradle to take her hand. "He is your son, and he is perfect. The circumstances of his birth do not matter. What matters is the love we give him and the life we build for him." "He is your son too," Sarah said firmly. "You are the one who will raise him, who will teach him and guide him. You are his father in every way that matters." Elijah's eyes filled with tears again, and he brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "Thank you for giving me this, Sarah. Thank you for trusting me with your heart and your life." "Thank you for saving me," Sarah replied, "for giving me a home and a future, and a love I never thought I would have." Winter came early that year, but inside the cabin, there was warmth and light and laughter. James grew quickly, his dark hair thickening and his eyes changing to a warm brown that reminded Sarah of her mother. He was a happy baby, quick to smile and curious about everything, and both Sarah and Elijah delighted in every new development. As the months passed, their family settled into a comfortable rhythm. Elijah expanded the cabin, adding a second room for James and building a larger storeroom for their supplies. He talked about buying more land, about raising cattle and horses, about building a legacy for their son. Sarah supported all of it, her own dreams aligning with his, both of them working toward a future that was bright and full of possibility. One evening in early spring, as Sarah nursed James in her rocking chair and Elijah worked on a new set of shelves, she realized that she had not thought about her old life in months. Cheyenne, Gerald, The fear and the running, all of it felt like something that had happened to someone else. She was Sarah Thornton now, wife and mother, and her life was here, in this cabin on the mountain, with the man she loved and the son they were raising together. "What are you thinking about?" Elijah asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "Just how lucky I am," Sarah said, smiling at him. "I ran into the mountains expecting to die, and instead, I found you. I found home." Elijah set down his tools and came to kneel beside her chair, his hand resting on James's head. "I am the lucky one. I was just existing up here going through the motions until you came along. You gave me a reason to live again, Sarah. You and James, you are my whole world." Sarah leaned down to kiss him, a soft press of lips that held all the love and gratitude she felt. "And you are ours." As the years passed, their family grew. Sarah gave birth to a daughter 2 years after James, a little girl with Elijah's gray eyes and Sarah's smile that they named Emma. 3 years after that came another son, Daniel, who had his father's build and his mother's stubborn determination. The cabin grew with them, expanding to accommodate the children, and Elijah's dreams of a ranch began to take shape as he acquired livestock and fenced-in pastures. Life was not always easy. There were harsh winters and lean years, illnesses and accidents that tested their strength and their faith. But through it all, Sarah and Elijah stood together, their love a constant anchor that held them steady. They taught their children to be kind and strong, to value honesty and hard work, to respect the land and the animals that shared it with them. James grew into a fine young man, tall and broad-shouldered like Elijah, with a gentle nature that made him a favorite among the neighbors who had slowly settled the mountains around them. He never knew that Elijah was not his biological father, and even after Sarah and Elijah told him the truth when he was old enough to understand, it made no difference to him. "You are my father," James said firmly, gripping Elijah's shoulder. "You are the one who raised me, who taught me everything I know. The man who gave me life does not matter. You are the one who gave me love." Elijah had wept then, just as he had wept the day James was born, and Sarah had held them both, her heart full to bursting with love for her family. Emma and Daniel thrived as well, growing strong and capable, learning to ride and shoot and tend the livestock with skill that made their parents proud. The ranch prospered, becoming known throughout the territory for its quality horses and cattle, and people came from miles around to do business with Elijah Thornton, the mountain man who had built an empire through sheer determination and hard work. But it was not the success or the prosperity that mattered most to Sarah. It was the quiet moments, the evenings spent on the porch watching the sunset with Elijah's hand in hers, the laughter of her children playing in the yard, the peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be. One autumn evening, when the children were grown and starting families of their own, Sarah and Elijah sat together in their rocking chairs, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. Sarah was in her 50s now, her hair streaked with gray, and Elijah's beard was more white than brown, but the love between them was as strong as ever. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet. "Taking me in that night? Tying your life to mine?" Elijah turned to look at her, his gray eyes as sharp and clear as they had been the day they met. "Not for a single moment. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah. You gave me a life worth living." "You gave me the same," Sarah said, reaching for his hand. "I was running from death when I found you, and you showed me how to live. I love you, Elijah Thornton, more than words can say." "I love you too, Sarah," Elijah replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "Always and forever." They sat together as the stars came out, their hands clasped, their hearts at peace. Behind them, in the warm glow of the cabin, they could hear the sounds of their family, James and his wife preparing dinner, Emma's children playing on the floor, Daniel chopping wood for the fire. It was a life full of love and laughter, a life they had built together from nothing, and it was more than either of them had ever dared to dream. The night James was born, Elijah had wept because he thought he could never have a family. Now, surrounded by the proof that love and determination could overcome anything, he knew that every tear had been worth it. And Sarah, who had once been running for her life through a snowstorm, knew that sometimes the darkest moments led to the brightest futures. Their love story was not conventional, and their path had been anything but easy. But it was theirs, built on trust and respect and a love that had weathered every storm. As they rocked together in their chairs, watching the mountains that had brought them together, Sarah and Elijah knew that they had found something rare and precious. They had found home in each other, and that was the greatest gift of all. The seasons continued to turn, bringing with them the inevitable changes of life. Sarah and Elijah grew older, their bodies moving more slowly but their spirits remaining strong. They became grandparents many times over, their cabin often filled with the sounds of grandchildren running through the rooms, their laughter echoing off the mountains that had witnessed the beginning of their love story. James married a girl from the neighboring ranch, a sweet woman named Catherine, who reminded Sarah of herself at that age, full of determination and quiet strength. They gave Sarah and Elijah 3 grandchildren, 2 boys and a girl, and built their own cabin just over the ridge, close enough to help with the ranch, but far enough to have their own space. Emma married a teacher who came west to educate the children in the growing settlements, and they moved to the small town that had sprung up at the base of the mountain. But they visited often, bringing their 2 daughters with them, and Emma never lost her love for the mountains and the ranch where she had grown up. Daniel, the youngest, took over the day-to-day operations of the ranch as Elijah's strength began to fail. He had inherited his father's head for business and his mother's compassion, and under his management the ranch continued to thrive. He married late, at 30, to a widow with a young son, and together they had 2 more children, expanding the family even further. Sarah watched it all with a sense of deep satisfaction, seeing the legacy that she and Elijah had created. Every child and grandchild was a testament to the love they shared, to the life they had built from nothing but determination and faith. She thought sometimes about that terrified woman who had stumbled through the snow so many years ago and marveled at how far she had come. Elijah's health began to decline in his late 60s, his body finally showing the wear of years of hard labor in the harsh mountain environment. He developed a cough that would not go away, and though he tried to hide it from Sarah, she saw the way he struggled for breath sometimes, the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking. "You need to see a doctor," Sarah insisted one morning after a particularly bad coughing fit left him pale and trembling. "I am fine," Elijah protested, but Sarah was having none of it. "You are not fine, and I am not going to lose you because you are too stubborn to seek help. James can take you to town tomorrow, and that is final." Elijah knew better than to argue when Sarah used that tone, so he agreed, and the next day James drove him to town in the wagon. The doctor examined him thoroughly and confirmed what Sarah had feared. Elijah's lungs were damaged, likely from years of exposure to cold and smoke and dust, and there was little that could be done except to make him comfortable. "How long?" Elijah asked, his voice steady even though his hands gripped the arms of the chair tightly. "Hard to say," the doctor replied honestly. "Could be months, could be years. But you need to take it easy, no more heavy labor, and stay warm and dry as much as possible." Elijah nodded, thanked the doctor, rode home with James in silence. When they arrived, he found Sarah waiting on the porch, her face anxious, and he knew he could not hide the truth from her. "It is my lungs," he said simply, taking her hand. "They are damaged, and the doctor says there is nothing to be done." Sarah felt her world tilt, but she steadied herself, drawing on the strength that had carried her through so many difficulties. "Then, we will make the most of the time we have. We will not waste a single day feeling sorry for ourselves." And they did not. Over the months that followed, Elijah slowly stepped back from the physical labor of the ranch, letting Daniel and James take over while he focused on spending time with Sarah and their family. They took walks together in the meadow when the weather was fine, Elijah leaning on a cane but still determined to enjoy the land he loved. They sat together by the fire in the evenings, talking about their life and their memories, laughing over old stories and marveling at how blessed they had been. The grandchildren visited often, bringing noise and chaos and joy into the cabin, and Elijah delighted in telling them stories about the old days, about hunting bears and surviving winters, and the time their grandmother had arrived at his door, half frozen and desperate. The children listened with wide eyes, fascinated by the idea of their grandparents as young people with adventures and challenges. One spring day, nearly 2 years after the doctor's diagnosis, Elijah and Sarah were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Elijah suddenly turned to her. "Sarah, I need to tell you something." She looked at him, seeing the seriousness in his expression, and felt her heart clench. "What is it?" "I want you to know that I am not afraid of dying," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I have lived a good life, better than I ever expected, and I am ready when the time comes. But Sarah, I need you to promise me that you will not let my death destroy you. You are strong, stronger than anyone I have ever known, and I need you to keep living, to keep being there for our children and grandchildren." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but she nodded. "I promise. But Elijah, I do not know how to live without you. You have been my whole world for so long. And you will always carry me in your heart," Elijah said, reaching out to cup her face with his large, scarred hands. "Just as I will carry you in mine wherever I go. Love does not end with death, Sarah. It goes on, binding us together across whatever comes next." Sarah leaned into his touch, memorizing the feel of his hands on her skin, the warmth of his gray eyes, the strength that still radiated from him even as his body failed. "I love you, Elijah Thornton. I have loved you since the moment you opened your door to a desperate woman in a snowstorm." "And I love you, Sarah Thornton," Elijah replied. "You are the best part of my life, the reason I wake up every morning with gratitude. Thank you for choosing me, for building this life with me." They kissed then, a gentle press of lips that held decades of love and commitment, and when they pulled apart, they both knew that their time together was growing short. But instead of being sad, they chose to be grateful, to treasure every moment they had left. Elijah passed away on a clear autumn morning, with Sarah holding his hand and their children gathered around his bed. He went peacefully, his breathing simply stopping as he slept, a slight smile on his face as if he was dreaming of something pleasant. Sarah sat with him for a long time after, holding his hand and talking to him, telling him about all the things she was grateful for, all the ways he had made her life better. The funeral was held 3 days later, with what seemed like half the territory in attendance. Elijah had been respected and loved by everyone who knew him, and people came from miles around to pay their respects. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple stone marker that read, "Elijah Thornton, beloved husband, father, and friend." Sarah stood at the grave long after everyone else had left, staring at the freshly turned earth and feeling the weight of her loss. But she remembered her promise, remembered Elijah's words about strength and love enduring, and she straightened her shoulders and turned back toward the cabin. She still had work to do, a family to care for, a life to live, and she would do it in a way that honored the man she loved. The years after Elijah's death were difficult, but Sarah found solace in her children and grandchildren, in the routines of the ranch and the changing of the seasons. She moved in with Daniel and his family, not wanting to be alone in the cabin that held so many memories, and she threw herself into helping with the grandchildren, teaching them the skills she had learned, passing on the stories and the values that she and Elijah had held dear. She lived to be 82, a formidable matriarch who commanded respect and love in equal measure. Her mind stayed sharp until the end, and she delighted in seeing her great-grandchildren born, in watching the family she and Elijah had created continue to grow and thrive. When Sarah finally passed away on a snowy December night, she went with a smile on her face, her last words a whisper of Elijah's name. Her children found her in her bed the next morning, looking peaceful and content, as if she had simply fallen asleep and decided not to wake up. They buried her next to Elijah on the hill, and on her marker they carved, "Sarah Thornton, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, reunited with her love." The whole territory mourned her passing, remembering the kind woman who had come to the mountains as a refugee and built a dynasty through love and determination. Years later, on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the pines and the sun set behind the peaks, people swore they could see 2 figures walking hand in hand through the meadow, a tall man with broad shoulders and a woman with silver hair, their love enduring beyond death, bound together for eternity by the choices they had made and the life they had built. The ranch continued to prosper through the generations, each new family adding their own chapter to the story while honoring the legacy of Elijah and Sarah. The cabin where it all began was preserved, turned into a family museum of sorts, filled with the tools and furniture that Elijah had made with his own hands, the rocking chair where Sarah had nursed her children, the bed where James had been born and where both Elijah and Sarah had drawn their last breaths. And in the center of it all, in a place of honor on the mantel, sat a small wooden box containing the letters that Elijah and Sarah had written to each other over the years. They had started the tradition early in their marriage, writing notes to each other for special occasions or just because, and they had saved every single one. Their children and grandchildren would read them sometimes, marveling at the love and tenderness captured in the faded ink, seeing their strong, capable parents as young lovers full of hope and dreams. One letter in particular was treasured above all others. It was written by Elijah on the night James was born, his handwriting shaky with emotion, and it read, "My dearest Sarah, tonight I watched you bring our son into the world, and I wept because I could not contain the love and gratitude I feel. You are the bravest, strongest woman I have ever known, and I am humbled to be your husband. Our son is perfect, and I vow to be the father he deserves, to raise him with love and teach him honor and integrity. You have given me everything, Sarah, a family, a purpose, a reason to be better than I ever thought I could be. I love you more than words can express, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you. Forever yours, Elijah." It was a love story for the ages, born in desperation and hardship, but nurtured into something beautiful and enduring. Elijah and Sarah's descendants would tell the story to their own children and grandchildren, keeping alive the memory of the mountain man who opened his door to a stranger and the woman who had the courage to accept his love. The mountains where they had lived and loved and raised their family stood as silent witnesses to it all, unchanging and eternal, holding the echoes of laughter and tears, of first steps and last breaths, of a love that had conquered every obstacle and built something lasting. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the hardships they had faced or the struggles they had overcome, but the love they had shared and the legacy they had created. Elijah and Sarah Thornton had taken two broken lives and woven them together into something whole and beautiful, proving that even in the harsh wilderness of the American West, love could not only survive but thrive. Their story became legend in those mountains, passed down through generations as a testament to what was possible when two people chose each other and refused to give up. The town that grew at the base of the mountain eventually took the name Thornton in honor of the family that had been there from the beginning, and a statue was erected in the town square showing a man and woman standing hand in hand, gazing out at the mountains they had called home. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Elijah and Sarah was not in the buildings or the statues or even the thriving ranch. It was in the values they had instilled in their children and grandchildren, the understanding that love was not just a feeling, but a choice, made every day through actions and sacrifices and commitment. It was in the knowledge that home was not a place, but the people you chose to share your life with, and that family was built not just by blood, but by the bonds of love and respect. The cabin on the mountain stood for over 100 years, weathering storms and seasons, a monument to the love story that had begun there. And when visitors came to see it, when they stood in the room where James had been born and imagined Elijah weeping with joy as he held his newborn son, they felt something shift inside them, a recognition of what really mattered in life. Love, family, commitment, these were the things that endured. These were the things that made life worth living. And Elijah and Sarah Thornton had understood that truth, had lived it every day of their lives together, and had passed it on to every generation that came after them. Their love story had started with a desperate knock on a cabin door on a freezing winter night, and it had ended decades later with two lives fully lived and a legacy that would never be forgotten. In between, there had been hardship and joy, pain and laughter, struggles and triumphs, but through it all, there had been love, constant and unwavering and true. And that, in the end, was everything.